I don't think a lot of people realize, and I say this as someone now, I love the modern alliance between the United States and Japan. You guys know I'm a huge anime fan. I love Japanese food. I even like some J-pop. Shut up. And I love a lot of the tradition and the methodicalness of the culture. There's a lot of, and I love their films. That being said, I think it is a real, it's a dereliction of duty to not teach about everything that led up to why the United States felt that it was necessary to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and why Truman why that decision ultimately ended up being the correct one. And everyone always talks about how awful it was and how mean and malicious, but I'm going to tell you this. I'm a huge World War II buff, and I don't know if people realize the extent of depravity that has, as it relates to the war crimes committed by the Japanese at that point in World War II, during World War II. Some of the stuff I can't even get into on air because it's that bad. I was just telling Kane, that was just some of it, Kane.
I was literally surprised to hear it. And I've heard a lot of stories from even family and friends that have family that fought in the war, but I never heard anything like that.
Let me tell. Here's one story I can tell you, because whether it's, I know people know about the death marches, but the rape of Nanking, there's all kinds of stuff. There's some horrific stuff that was done, and including cannibalism. And I don't know if everybody realized, George H.W. Bush at the time was the same age as my oldest son is now. And he was a pilot. And, Navy pilots, they were doing these bombing runs. There was a tiny island that they were doing these runs over during World War II. And they had to evade the Japanese while they were doing it. Some of them, they were shot down. And James Bradley wrote about this. He had a book called Flyboys, and he was writing about this. And it is terrifying, because when you look at the files and the records and everything that went on during the war crimes tribunals and involving Japan, there were pilots who were eaten. So George H.W. Bush, the story goes, and there are pictures of him being rescued. Like, these pictures exist. They're in the National Archives. He had to abandon his bomber. And Japanese, at the time when they would capture American soldiers, a lot of them were tortured and killed. They would sometimes, like on the Bataan Death March, a lot of them, the soldiers and other POWs, Japanese would practice their katana skills on them. This all came out during the tribunals. And many of these troops here on this island were beheaded. Some of the Navy pilots, in the manner that they were slaughtered, they had surgeons cut off their thigh muscles, slice up their livers, and they were prepared as a dish for officers. And George H.W. Bush, he bailed out of his aircraft, and he was in the water for several hours. And American planes were trying to protect him from the Japanese boats coming out to get him from this same island where they were eating POWs. And he was rescued by the USS Finback. And it actually came up. It surfaced right by him. And they, he said that James Bradley, there was a piece from the Telegraph where it talked about how George H.W. Bush's comrades were eaten by Japanese captors and how he actually narrowly avoided that. And Bradley said, there wasn't any shock or horror. They are veterans of a different generation. And Bush didn't know about how close he came to that until later on. And that's just one example. And but what gets me, he's the same age as my oldest son is now when all that happened. Wow. You imagine? So that is one example. I'm not getting into all of the horrible stuff that happened in Manila, where you would have women and girls as young as 12 who were taken to what they call the rape hotel. In fact, it was only until recently that the comfort women, who were exactly as you think it is, forced into that by the military, Japan's military at the time, that was formally acknowledged. The atrocities that were carried out are some of the worst things I've ever heard of. And I'm not even getting into the germ warfare or the bio warfare that they were experimenting on, or I mean, it's just the atrocities. It's something that I think today modern countries and modern governments struggle to try to reconcile. And so I say this because, when you talk about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I know we're running out of time here, Japan they were not going to surrender. And we had to have a surrender with, no conditions surrender. That's just at full surrender. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons why it was the best decision, because you were going to have so many more casualties without that. I know some people think, well, that's kind of, that's anti-intuitive. How is that? How in the world would that be? Because they weren't going to surrender. One of the books you got to read, a guy over at Notre Dame wrote it. It's called The Most Controversial Decision. And this is a really good book that you must read. It's called The Most Controversial Decision, Truman, the Atomic Bombs, and the Defeat of Japan. It's written by Wilson Miscampbell. And he wrote this, a number of years ago. It's a good book, and it gets into even like the minutes of meetings, conversations between military, all this kind of stuff, and it gets into it. It's a must read. But yes, it was the right decision, and people so far removed from history and fact don't get to, be keyboard pundits all these years later, buffered by the bravery of that generation, and get to try to pass judgment and say it wasn't the correct thing to do. You're wrong.